Shalom Chavarim. Welcome to our last video. And for that occasion, I want to blow the shofar to remind us that the Lord sees and the Lord is a good God and will do the right thing, just what you need to help you love and serve Him with all of your heart, soul, and strength. So the ram's horn is a vivid celebration of God's perfect provision. And He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And as He provided for Abraham, He will provide for you. Amen. Amen. In today's video, we want to love and appreciate God's gift of the Niphal. The Niphal is the passive form of the cow, generally speaking, but it can also indicate reflexivity, and we see an abundance of these Niphal forms in a critical passage in the Bible that Jesus read. Genesis 32, verses 23 through 33 is chock full of Niphals. So we'll read this in Hebrew, we'll translate, and we'll talk about the use of the Niphal in this central, pivotal text. Let's dive in. Genesis 32, verse 23. Vayakom balayla hu vayikach eith shetei nashau va'eith shetei shevchothau va'eith achaz gasar yelavau. That's an Athnak, so we'll stop there. That is a cow narrative, third masculine singular from kum. And then he arose in the night. Who? And then he arose in that night. And then he took, eighth marks the object, Shetei Nashau. Two of his wives. Two wives, that's a problem, right? God made one wife for Adam. In the New Testament, we read that the elder should be the husband of one wife. Monogamy is God's plan, not polygamy. Two of his wives and two of his maid servants. Wa'eth achad asar. Achad is 1, asar is 10, and 11. 1 plus 10 is 11. It's always good to review our math. And 11 of his youths. Waya'avor eighth ma'avar yabok. This cholam indicates this is a cow form. And then he crossed the ford of the Jabbok, the crossing of the Jabbok. And then he crossed the crossing of the Jabbok. The Jabbok is a beautiful river in Jordan, modern-day Jordan. In fact, if you go with us to Israel next summer, we're going to start off in Jordan, and we're actually going to stand where Jacob stood at the ford of the Jabbok River. It's beautiful. It's breathtaking. But this kind of sets the stage that Jacob is in what we call the Transjordan, on the east side of the Jordan River, from the reference point of the Promised Land. The Promised Land is on the west side of the Jordan River. The Transjordan is on the east side. He's there. And he is on the lam, so to speak. Last time he met his brother, Esau wanted to kill Jacob for stealing his birthright, for his maltreatment of Esau. He vowed to kill Jacob. So Jacob is afraid of his brother, probably all these years. And he knows he's moving in the vicinity of where he might see his brother Esau. Let's read verse 24. Vayikachein vaya'avirein eith hanachal. That's an Athnak, so we'll pause here. And then he took them. Aim is an object. The root of this word is lakach. The Lamed assimilates into the Kof. And then he took them, and then he sent them. Now, this is a Niphal form, as you can tell by this Hirik. Typically in the Niphal, you have a Hirik Yod infix. But in this word, all it is a Hirik. So, and then he caused them to cross. And then he sent them over Eith HaNachal. A Nachal is a wadi. A wadi is a riverbed that in the rainy season is filled with water and becomes a stream. In the non-rainy season, it's empty. It is a dried up riverbed. So, and then he took them and then he sent them across the wadi. Waya'aver. And then he sent, that's a Niphal narrative, third masculine singular from Ayin, Beit Resh. And then he sent, eighth marks what he sent. Asher lo. What belonged to him? His stuff, his belongings. And then he sent what belonged to him. So he sends the wives, the maidservants, the ewes over first. Then he sends his stuff across the Jabbok River. Verse 25. Here's where we encounter our first Niphal form. The first word of verse 25 is a Niphal. Let's read it, then we'll translate. Wayewater Yaakov levado. That's the Athnak, so we'll pause here. What we have here is a Niphal. The root is Waw Tau Resh. And in the prefix forms, the imperfect forms and the narrative forms, when you have a doubled first root consonant, it indicates that it's a Niphal. Because what happens is the nun of the Niphal gets assimilated into the first root consonant. So this is a Niphal narrative, third masculine singular from Yod Tau Resh. Yod Tau Resh means remainder. But in this passive Niphal form, it means that he was left. He remained. And Jacob was left levado. Ba is solitude, la is 2 or 4, and O is his. To his solitude. For his solitude. He was left alone. Just the position in which God wanted him to be. Now God can deal with him. Because the issue is not with his brother Esau. The issue is with God. So God's going to wrestle with him and reason with him and restore him and change his name. Let's read on. Waye'avek ish gemo gav galoth ha shachar. Here's another Niphal. Niphal narrative. Three MS from Aleph, Beith, Kov. Now, avak has to do with wrestling. One of the major meanings of the Niphal is reciprocity. So when one person wrestles another, they're exerting force, they're receiving force, it goes back and forth. A perfect word to be cast in the Niphal form. The subject is the Ish. Now, Ish is the word for man, but it can also mean one who appears as a man, one who's animate, one that has human flesh. Now, as we read on, I actually take this Ish to be pre-incarnate Christ. And I'll tell you why as we go on. But and then an Ish, one who appears as a man, wrestled with him until the ascending of the dawn. This is an infinitive, until the ascending of the dawn. So this wrestling match is going on while it's dark. And Jacob probably thinks that it's Esau because he's afraid of Esau. because Esau vowed to kill Jacob. So it's dark, it's in an unfamiliar territory to him, and he's wrestling with this Ish all night long. Now, as the wrestling match proceeds, he begins to see that it's not Esau, but it's God himself. And God deals with him. Verse 26. Wayar ki lo yakol lo, wayiga bakath yereko. That's our Athnax, so we'll stop there. And then he saw that he was not able to him, and he touched literally the palm or the sole of his thigh. Now, this word kaf denotes the fleshy part of the palm or the sole. Typically, the skin is thinner, it's more sensitive, and so the inference will be the vulnerable part of the thigh of Jacob. So, this Ish saw that he was not able to him, and he touched the fleshy part of his thigh. What does this mean, he was not able to him? What it means is that Jacob was not giving up. That he had to use special force to disable Jacob. So, since Jacob becomes aware at some point that this is God himself, the earnestness in wrestling shows his earnestness for God. The fact that this man whose name means deceiver, Yaakov means he deceived. When he came out of the womb, he was grabbing the heel of his brother. That is a euphemism for deception. In fact, in the English language, if you call someone a heel, that's always negative, right? But the man saw that he was not able to him. In other words, that Jacob was not giving up. And then he touched the fleshy part of his thigh, simply touched it. Now, this root nagah is used in the plagues of Exodus. So God touched the Egyptians with darkness, with boils, with frogs, with all these calamities. And when the Passover meal is celebrated today, when the Israelites sit around the table, they take their finger in the cup of wine, and when they pronounce each of the plagues of the Exodus, they flick the wine on the mat with the finger to denote God touched the Egyptians with these plagues. And that's how effortless it was for the omnipotent God to send these kind of plagues. He simply touched them. So it was a divine touch. And then he touched the fleshy part of his thigh, probably giving him a hip pointer, dislocating his hip. Human physiology shows us that the core of our anatomy is where the most power resides. We become weaker and weaker as we move out from that core. By the time you get up here, you're pretty weak physically, but hopefully mental strength compensates for that. Okay? So you just kind of, by touching the kaf yereko, the fleshy part of his thigh, he disables him. Let's read on. Wateka kaf yerek Yaakov, bahe avako gemo. This is a cow form. And then it was dislocated. And then the fleshy part of the thigh of Jacob. So that's a noun phrase. We take these three words together. And then the fleshy part of the thigh of Jacob was dislocated in his wrestling with him. This form is a Niphal infinitive construct from Aleph, Beth, Kof. Aleph, Beth, Kof is the root. And then you have a pronoun which indicates here the subject of the infinitive, third masculine singular. And then the fleshy part of the thigh of Jacob was dislocated in his wrestling with him. So, once again, The Niphal lends itself to this prolonged wrestling match. Jacob exerts force. The man exerts force. There's tugging, there's pulling, there's headlocks. Now, for those of you wrestling fans of the WWE and other varieties, there's no turnbuckle here. John Cena, those kind of folks aren't involved here. This is good old-fashioned wrestling, probably to the point of death, as they might do in the ancient Greek Olympics. This is Greco-Roman style wrestling. There's a lot of intense struggle back and forth. This isn't the entertainment that we find in the WWE. This is old-fashioned wrestling. This is a long time ago. So you have to eschew any of those associations of this wrestling we see today on tube. It's funny, I was in Israel a couple of years ago, and I was talking with a little Israeli youth, and he knew all of the WWE stars. He had watched that on TV, and he was kind of fascinated by these actors whom he thought were these great athletes. But that's not what we have here. What we have here is the good old style, Greco-Roman style wrestling, even before Greco-Roman style wrestling came to be. Okay, the next verse. And notice, you wrestling fans, he didn't give him a headbutt either. That wasn't there. It just kind of touched his fleshy part of his thigh. Wayomer shalacheni ki gala ha-shachar. Now, who is speaking at this juncture? It is the man. It is pre-incarnate Christ. And then he said, shalacheni, release me. This is a PL imperative, masculine singular, from Shin Lamed Chayf with the first common singular object suffix. Release me because the dawn ascended. Cal perfect 3ms from Ayin Lamed Hey. The dawn has come up. The dawn has come up. Now, in Hebrew narrative, you have to figure out who's speaking. It's not always explicit. I think what makes the most sense in this context is this is the Ish speaking. Because this is clearly Jacob asking for a blessing from the Ish. Now, think about it. We learn in scriptural theology that the greater one blesses the inferior person in terms of blessing and status before God and so forth. So Jacob, being this great patriarch, must have recognized that this man has a blessing to give. He knows it's no longer Esau. He no longer thinks it's Esau, but he realizes that the person with whom he's wrestling, the being with whom he's wrestling, is actually divine. That's why he asked for a blessing. And then he said, I will not release you. That's a PL imperfect. We can tell it's a PL by this schwa, thematic connecting vowel, that doubling dot of the middle root consonant. There's the root. I will not release you, ki'in. That's a couplet. Unless you bless me. So, Beit Resh Kaf is the root. Tau marks it as a 2ms subject. Unless you bless me. And then he said, I will not release you until you bless me. So here's Jacob. He's been wrestling all night. And he says to the man, I will not release you until you bless me. This man who is named Deceiver, Yaakov, actually has a spiritual capacity. And he's saying to God himself, pre-incarnate Christ, I am not going to let you go until you bless me. He wanted the blessing. He kind of shows that in his deceiving Esau for the birthright, right? He was the second one born. But through deception, he steals the birthright from Esau. But now in a much more positive context, he's wrestling with God and he says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. Do you want to be blessed by God? How earnest are you in that pursuit? Every person is as holy as they want to be. Every person is as used by God as they truly want to be, but sometimes it takes wrestling. And the one with whom we need to wrestle is not our brother or our sister. It's God. Lots of life lessons in this passage, aren't there? Let's look at verse 28. Vayomer Elau, Ma Shemaka. And then he says to him, what is your name? Vayomer Yaakov. And then he says, Jacob. So obviously, this speaker is the Ish. And he says, what is your name? And Jacob answers, well, my name is Yaakov, which means he deceives. God is omniscient. He knows everything. What he is doing here is engaging Jacob in conversation. Yes, he knows the name of Jacob. He's just engaging him in conversation. So what is your name? And then he changes his name. So verse 29. Verse 29. Vayomer lo Yaakov Ye'amer Gov Shemka Ki'im Yisrael. This is the pivotal point in the nation of Israel's history. And then he said, the speaker here is the Ish, whom I'm taking to be pre-incarnate Christ. The second person of the Godhead before the incarnation in Bethlehem. And then he said, not Jacob. And then here's a Niphal. This is a Niphal, imperfect, 3ms from Amar. Aleph, Main, Resh. Not Jacob. Will it be called? See, that is the passive voice. Be called. Still your name. So, your name becomes the subject of this verb. Your name will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will no longer be called Jacob. Ki'im. Those two words are a couplet in Hebrew. Together they mean but rather. But rather Israel, which means he wrestles God. Now, it's a different root for wrestling, but it means wrestling still. So he said, and then he said, not Jacob will your name be called still, but rather Israel. He wrestles God, is what Israel means. Kisaritha. So, the connection between Israel and wrestling is found with this verb. That's a Cal Perfect 2ms from Sin, Resh, week. We can call this Aleph or Yod. For you wrestled, Gim Elohim, with God, Wagim Anashim, and with men, and you were able. And you were able, or you prevailed. So, let's think about the beauty of this Hebrew. For you wrestled with God and with men, and you prevailed, and you were able. The use of Elohim here gives credence to the proposition that the Ishir is God himself. It's pre-incarnate Christ. It's the Word of God, taking on human flesh for this occasion. He did not take on flesh permanently until Bethlehem. But this Christophany, this appearance of Christ in pre-incarnate form, is supported by God saying, you wrestled with God and with men, and you were able. So what we see in the Ish is God taking on human flesh. So that's the sense that he's wrestling with Elohim and with men and prevailing. So, a beautiful passage made more vivid by understanding these Niphal forms. Verse 30. Vayish'al Yaakov Vayomer Hagitha Na Shemaka Vayomer Lamazeh Tish'al Lishmi. That's our ethnic, so we'll pause there. And then Jacob asked and said. We call that a hendiadys. Hendiadys means 1 through 2. You have 2 verbs to express one idea. And then he asked and said. He asked by saying. That's a single idea in English typically. But 2 Hebrew verbs are used to communicate that. You actually see that a lot in the Greek New Testament. That is not common in classical Greek. The Greek New Testament gets that from the Septuagint, which is translating the Hebrew Bible. So hendiadys, as a grammatical and a syntactical function and a feature of Hebrew, is seen in the Greek New Testament via the Hebrew influence on it. So Jacob, and then Jacob asked and said, declare. Niphal, imperative, masculine singular from Nun Gimel Dalet. Declare your name. So Jacob, whose name is now Israel, doesn't quite understand the relative relationship between him and the man. So he says, well, he asked me my name. I told him, now I will ask this Ish his name. So he said, declare to me your name. And then he said, now the man is speaking, pre-incarnate Christ. And then he said, Lamazeh, what is this? You ask my name. Cal imperfect, 2ms from Shin Aleph Lamed. What is this you ask my name? Wayeh Vadik Otho Sham. And then he blessed him there. PL narrative, 3rd masculine singular from Beth Resh Kaf. And then he blessed him there. This is 2 more pieces of evidence that show us this Ish is divine. Number 1, it's not a reciprocal relationship between the man and Israel. The man asks Israel for his name. He tells him, that's Jacob. Here, Israel asks the man for his name, and he says, what is this you ask my name? So he doesn't give him his name. See, because he doesn't have to, because he's the creator of Israel. He changed his name. The very fact that the man changed his name from Jacob to Israel shows that he's divine. Names are given at birth. In order to change someone's name, someone of a patriarchal status like Jacob has to be divine. Because it shows that he has complete dominion and sovereignty over the future of this man. And so instead of being called deceiver, he wants him to be known as the God wrestler. And it's interesting, throughout the Old Testament, if God wants to denote the sinful frailty of the man, he'll call him Jacob, deceiver. If he wants to underscore the promises, the spiritual capacity, the blessings of the man, he'll call him Israel. So, that becomes a very key theme in the Hebrew Bible. Now, the fact that he blesses him there. Okay. The greater one blesses the lesser one. So this man has come. He's had a close encounter with Jacob. He changes his name from Jacob to Israel. And then he blesses him there. And he sets him in motion to be a fitting patriarch for the nation of Israel. God's chosen people. Let's look at verse 31. Vayikra Yaakov Shem Hamakom Peniel. That's our ethnic, so we'll pause there. And then Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. Peniel means face of God. Peniel. Right on the northern border, the northern edge of the Jabbok River. Come there with me next summer. We're going to actually stand where Jacob stood. He called the name of that place Peniel, face of God, because I saw Elohim, God, Panim el Panim, face to face. Now it's interesting. Moses spoke with God, Panim el Panim, face to face. Panim means presence. God the Father is invisible. No man has seen God at any time. But still, the fullness of who God is can be expressed and received by people if God manifests it, right? So he says, for I saw God face to face, Watinatzel nafshi. Watinatzel nafshi. And my life source was rescued. Here's another Niphal. This is a Niphal narrative. Third feminine singular from Natsal. Nun Zade Lamed. That means to rescue. And my life source was rescued. In other words, when God touched the fleshy part of Jacob's thigh, he could have killed him. It was a fearful thing to wrestle with God all night long. But he survived that. He called the place Peniel because he saw God face to face and his life source was rescued. That root Natsal is very vivid. In the Exodus, it denotes the Israelites making bricks without straw, and God comes in and rescues them just as they're about to die of heat exhaustion and overwork. God lifts them out of the quicksand and puts their feet on a solid rock. This could have been the end of Jacob. Whether it was Esau coming to kill him, whether it was God simply exterminating him instead of just touching the fleshy part of his thigh, he was completely vulnerable to the graces of God. But God, in his compassion and love, doesn't do away with him. He changes his name, gives him a new identity, and says, your name will no longer be called Deceiver, but God Wrestler. And then he blessed him there. Isn't God a gracious God? Today you might be feeling, I'm unworthy to be a child of God, a servant of the King of Kings. But if God can turn the life of a deceiver around and make him a God wrestler, God can work in my life and your life as well. This shows us the grace of God. And this shows us how God responds to our earnest desire to be near him, to be blessed by him. Every person is as blessed as they want to be. Let us desire that blessing as Jacob did. Verse 32. Vayizrach lo hashemesh ka'asher avar eich Penuel. And then the sun arose just as he crossed Peniel. And he was limping. Zolea. Zolea means to limp. And he was limping upon his thigh. So he's walking along. He has a hip pointer. It's hard to move. He's immobile. What a reminder of his encounter with God. His disability temporarily was a vivid reminder that he had met God. He couldn't forget that. You know, any kind of physical memory of an occasion is typically pretty memorable, pretty penetrating. And this wrestling match would be remembered by Jacob by his dislocation of his hip, possibly, and he's limping upon his thigh. Last verse, verse 33. Al Cain lo yokalu v'nei Yisrael eith giv ha nasheh asher gal kaf hayarek gad hayom hazeh. So here is the perpetual reminder of this wrestling match in the name change from Jacob to Israel. Therefore, they do not eat. This is an imperfect verb, cal imperfect, third masculine plural. It accommodates the subject V'nei Yisrael, which is a masculine plural subject. Therefore, the children of Israel do not eat. This part is a little bit hard to translate. The sinew of the thigh, which is upon the flesh